So the first topic today actually comes from one of the podcast followers who pointed us to this paper, which is in JAMA Psychiatry, titled All Cause and Cause-Specific Mortality Among Individuals with Hypochondriasis. So that just means people who are hypochondriacs. And the context was a question around whether or not overemphasis on biological age testing, potentially other types of diagnostics, but specifically in the context of biological age testing, could either reflect an underlying psychological condition, such as hypochondriasis, and potentially even cause detrimental health outcomes in people. And so what this paper talked about was specifically in people who have hypochondriasis, which is a anxiety disorder where individuals have excessive fear of having a serious illness. And so what the study showed was that people who have this condition are at significantly higher risk of all-cause mortality. It was big. It was like, I think, 84% increased risk, and as well at higher risk for a bunch of different age-related conditions, right? So does this psychological disorder cause accelerated aging, increased risk of mortality? That's harder to answer, but clearly there is an association there. Okay, so again, nothing to do with biological age testing. The question would be, two questions, I guess. One is, could it be the case that people who are fixated on biological age testing are more likely to have this kind of a disorder? And then could being overly fixated on biological age testing actually cause higher risk of mortality, accelerated aging, higher risk of age-related diseases? So that was kind of the context of the question. And so, I mean, it's interesting to think about. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah. On the second question of whether doing these testings could lead to bad outcomes, you could imagine somebody who has this anxiety, who wants to be proactive in how they engage their health, to find that they are biologically advanced in age relative to what they expect, and then they would go seeking therapeutics, interventions. They would just start scouring different things that could have utility for them, taking it in a very open-ended fashion. And then, does that end up having an impact in some kind of way?
It could be good or bad, though. I mean, I think what you just said absolutely happens, right? There's no question about it that many people who take these biological age tests believe the results, or at least accept that the results might be right, then change their behavior based on the results. I think many people would say often they change their behavior in a good way. They eat better, they exercise more, they stop drinking as much. But then certainly some people go overboard and start doing things that are, probably detrimental to their health. So
you start getting into the stacks and getting into the different natural products or quick interventions you can aim at, things like that right now.
Yeah, but I mean, I think also a question would be, if you are susceptible to these underlying psychological conditions, could over-reliance on these and again, we're talking about the biological age test. I think this could be true of any advanced diagnostic or preventative diagnostic. Could you become overly fixated on that so that it becomes, from a psychological perspective, unhealthy? Again, obviously, I think that can be the case. I don't think we have any hard data one way or the other to say, to what extent is this a problem. I think we can all look at people in the biohacker community where we at least would look at them and be like, yeah, that guy's got a psychological issue. As an armchair, psychiatrist. But, I think how common is that? I don't know. I don't think we can answer that question.
Yeah. Well, and how does just baseline anxiety disorders, things like that, how does that genuinely fuel biological age in a way,
Right. I mean, I think it's still a little speculative, but there's good reason to believe that chronic anxiety and chronic stress certainly has detrimental health consequences and probably accelerates aspects of biological aging.
Yeah. I think as both of us being, first, second, third year CEOs running startup companies, we can definitely attest to the detrimental aspects of stress on fundamental qualities of the pillars of health, like sleep, for instance.
Well, I guess maybe I would reframe it and say, when you're in an environment, a high stress environment, it's even more important to make sure you focus on the pillars of health. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
So is this something like a provider might want to keep an eye out for when they're talking to a patient and making sure like this might not be a good candidate for an Aura Ring or a Whoop or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point. Again, we started because the question was about biological age tests, but you can think more about these wearables and things like that. And yes, I think, again, it's challenging because most, certainly primary care physicians or even docs that run their own concierge or longevity practices are not trained psychologists or psychiatrists. So they're probably hesitant to try to diagnose people. Certainly they should be looking out for anxiety disorders and chronic stress and can, to some extent, evaluate perhaps for this particular patient, the wearables are detrimental rather than positive. Again, we've talked about this before on the show. If you wear an Aura Ring and you sleep worse because you're worried about what the Aura Ring is going to tell you, that's not a great strategy for improving sleep quality.
Good example
so some of this is know yourself as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So my other sort of thought would be if you have an influencer who has a blueprint or a protocol, if you wink wink, if you push that really hard on a general audience, you might not know what percent have disorders like this. It might end up it could be a net negative in their health protocol.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Again, it's hard to quantify, and let's just start from the basic premise that most people out there genuinely want to help people. It's hard to know when you're giving people information. There is always the possibility that it's going to have a harmful impact rather than the helpful impact you're going for. I think in that specific case, yeah, it's really hard to know what percentage are harmed, what percentage are helped, what percentage just look at, the sort of insanity of a system like that and just be like,
yeah.
Something I was thinking about when you guys were talking was, how right now this influencer community and these ideas around, you have to do this to promote your biological age. If you're not doing X, Y, and Z, you're not maintaining your health in a certain kind of way, how that could also interact and fuel more anxiety, sort of a positive feedback.
That I think
loop.
was the sort of question, right?
Yeah,
could these sort of loops get set up where it actually can maybe not cause, but exacerbate an underlying propensity towards this sort of a disorder? Certainly possible. I think the take home again, so we've talked about the biological age tests. I don't believe the direct-to-consumer biological age tests work. I think the noise swamps the signal and people should not be using those in general. And that's a relatively new position for me, but it's pretty strong now after my personal experiment. But independent of that, if you are using these diagnostics and they are causing you anxiety, you need to be able to recognize that. And my advice would be stop using them.
Do you think there's an overlap between the type of person who goes deep down this rabbit hole of protocols and optimizing their health and hypochondriasis in terms of this field could attract people who want to do 3 biological age tests a year and every other sort of biomarker?
Yeah, I'm not a trained psychologist or psychiatrist. So from, talking from a position of, relative ignorance about this, I think that's probably true.
Yeah, insofar as those people, that hypochondriasis correlates with increased diligence towards your health. I think that's another kind of thing to pair with it. Because if you just kind of have generalized anxiety and it expresses itself through this kind of persistent worry about disease, but you're not really engaging it in a proactive manner, it may not in that kind of way.
Yeah, and I think also there's a gray area and a fine line between, appropriate concern, recognition of the need to pay attention to your health and detect potential problems early versus fixating on them to the point where it becomes detrimental. Like, it's not always going to be obvious. And I think we're probably all, anybody in this space who is doing, lots of tests, maybe trying out different interventions, is potentially susceptible to that.
I guess sort of last question is, can you two think of a time where maybe you've gone down this route, had a little bit of anxiety or fixation around a particular measurement?
Yeah, I think, when I did the experiment with the 4 different biological age tests in duplicate. And again, we've got an episode on that for people who want to watch it. Even though when the data came back, the rational part of my mind that understands statistics could look at the data and say, this is garbage. Like, you can't conclude anything from this data. The fact that on average, right, the results didn't show that I was biologically younger than my chronological age bothered me, despite the fact that I knew it was bullshit. Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'd say on the one side in my health journey, any kind of thing that deviates from my normal triggers a response where it's like, oh no, this is it. This is this is where it all begins and it goes from there. So I would say a little bit of my kind of maybe not being as aware of different things, or maybe the need for me to be more proactive. I definitely have increased diligence when I'm worried about something focal. I've got this little itchy spot of skin on my shin right now. It's like, okay, is this it? Like, what's kicking off? What's carcinogenic?
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because different. Obviously, again, we all have sort of different susceptibilities. But me, I'm like totally body unaware.
Oh, okay.
I'll look down and I'll have a giant cut. And I'm like, where the hell did that come from?
Yeah.
Right?
My example would be when my son was born, I had to take a break from my Aura Ring because in the middle of the night, I'm rocking him and I'm thinking about how on that Aura Ring, it knows I'm awake right now. And I'm thinking about my score. So I just had to stop wearing it with the newborn.
Funny.
That's kind of my other point is sort of, it's more of a general kind of human thing about our relationship to anxiety. You don't have anxiety about things that you don't perceive as important and you don't care about. And there's so many of those kind of things that we receive the idea that they are important and they are something we should have anxiety about. So, how that has a societal influence and a time-based influence as our cultures develop.
Yeah, that's actually another sort of interesting point. I know we're spending more time on this topic than we had intended, but, I think you can look at many of the sort of influencers in this space, and I think it is reasonable to say that they are having potentially a positive impact at a larger macro level because they are making more people think about their health, hopefully making it more cool to be healthy, right? And potentially also creating a lot of anxiety around the fact that we need to track our biological age and oh my God, So what the net positive versus negative is really hard to quantify at this point. Okay, so this next story is a relatively recent paper published in Nature out of the Allen Institute here in Seattle. Great institution. And it got picked up in the popular press. This particular article is from Fox News, titled Aging Hotspot Found in Brain. Researchers say major changes. So probably a lot of people have heard about this. I thought it would be interesting to talk about. Also kind of cool for Mitch and I because we both know the first author on this paper, Kelly Jin, really well. She was a former graduate student with our friend and colleague, Daniel Promislo. Kelly is awesome. Great to see that she's being super successful at the Allen Institute and doing very cool work.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so cool to have Kelly as a colleague when I overlapped with her in Daniel's lab. And she was leaving to the Allen Institute when I was moving forward in my studies. And this is one of the, just a real great paper for her to kind of begin or kind of move forward in that career with.
Yeah. So the kind of take homes from this study, maybe it's worth kind of describing what they did first, and then we can talk about what they found. So again, it was published in Nature. Nature is one of really the top two biomedical, really general scientific journals, but also in the biomedical space, Science and Nature are typically perceived as the top two journals to publish in. So very, very high impact, high profile paper. And what they were really trying to do was look at how gene expression, so which genes are turned on, which genes are turned off, which genes are turned up and down, changes with age in the brain. Lots of other people have done that previously in brain and lots of other tissues in mice. What kind of makes this study a little bit unique is they used a method called single cell transcriptomics, and they did it at a very high resolution. So they had more than 1 billion, I think, transcriptomes or cells that they looked at across many different regions of the brain. And they did it in compared young and middle-aged mice. So the question that they're able to now ask is, at this much more higher resolution level, how does gene expression in the brain change with age? The other thing that's important here is they did it in what we would call normative aging, not in the context of Alzheimer's disease or other neurodegenerative disease. So this is sort of like, what are the changes in the brain at the level of gene expression that happen during aging and potentially may contribute to neurodegenerative disease, but are not neurodegenerative disease itself. And it was really the first time that this had been done at this level.
From the 30,000 foot view, these kind of broad descriptive analyses that have, they're very important in the field. They've been very hot for quite a few years now. One of the biggest insights out of this is things don't age all the same, even in the same organism, even in the same organ, even in the same tissue. The nuances that we're getting better at teasing out through these methods, I think, are really going to be one of their biggest kind of benefits when we look back and think about this kind of single cell sequencing era that we're in right now.
Right. Right. I would agree with that. Well, I guess we should say explicitly this was done in mice, so they did not sacrifice middle-aged people to do this study. So the way it was done was they compared young and I think it was 18-month-old mice, which are, I don't know, it's kind of hard to say exactly what that is, but maybe like a 55-year-old biologically person. So, not old, but certainly to the point where you would expect to see some age-related changes. And so that was the comparison group. And then they asked what's different, right? And so this is where I think the study's really cool. I think the value of this data set, this sort of atlas, is really cool. I think at least for me, the take-home messages from the study, I was kind of like, we already knew that.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, sometimes that's the way it goes, right? So the take-homes were that lots of stuff changes. Okay, not shocking. Mm-hmm. Different cells, different regions of the brains change with age in their gene expression pattern in different ways. This is what Mitch was just saying. It's not all the same. The hypothalamus seems to be one of the places where you get the biggest changes, which is potentially interesting. Again, not shocking given what we already knew. And the biggest signal is increased inflammation. Again, not shocking. That is one of the hallmarks of aging. And I think many people would agree that, at least in mammals, it is one of the most important hallmarks of aging in terms of pathological conditions and age-related diseases. So that's why I say, for me, it was kind of like, did we learn anything fundamentally new here? Aside from the fact we now have this really cool data set that lots of people can play with, I'm not sure we did.
Yeah, the confirmatory part, this is also, kind of stuff that we already knew, but I liked that they saw a lot of these signals changing in glial cells as opposed to neurons. So that's a nuance of brain anatomy that, you've got the functional parts of the brain, the neurons that are basically the wiring that connect everything up. Then you've got the glial cells, which serve an accessory role. They help out in terms of waste product offloading, nutrient onloading, their general support structures for that actual circuitry. And that's where they were seeing more of this aged signature at. So I thought that was really cool. But again, to your point, like, we kind of had ideas that glia were important in aging prior to this.
Right. And I mean, we know that glial activation is a brain inflammatory response. Yep. So again, you're right. And it sort of, it reinforces what we kind of already believed was the case. So, which is not bad. Yeah. It's just like, for me, and again, maybe, I always want a big paper to kind of fundamentally change some aspect of the way I think about a problem. And to me, this didn't, but I know lots of people really value these really, really large data sets. And I see that. I just personally can't get that excited about it.
Yeah. The one thing that they did bring up in there too, it seemed like this is something I haven't came across at least before, and I'm not a neuroanatomist by any means, but they were looking at that it was like the third ventricle within the brain.
Right,
was
a substructure of the hypothalamus.
Yeah. So okay. If you call it third ventricle, it doesn't ping an intuition. But if you call it hypothalamus, I know about that one.
Yeah, which I think is something. And again, this is where I think this data set combined with a lot of the other stuff they've been doing at the Allen Institute of really mapping in a very detailed way the structure of the brain. Potentially combining those will give you that sort of new insight that maybe I'm just not seeing it. Like that's always a possibility too. There's some fundamentally new insight here that I'm just not seeing, which I recognize happens from time to time.
Yeah. Yeah. My one bigger gripes about sort of the single cell sequencing right now as it stands, it's incredibly hyper precise within an organism because you can resolve so many different cells out of a single organism, but the replication and the number of animals is still low. You know, looking at this study, it was like 40 or something aged animals, about 60 young
pretty
animals.
good for a
mouse
single
study.
cell. Well, for a single cell sequencing.
Oh,
study.
absolutely. Yeah. If you get 5 animals in a typical paper, like you're in the mark,
Right.
Yeah. But that's still so limited,
Right.
like aging is fundamentally nuanced and it depends at all these different levels. It also is going to have some important differences across sex, across individuals that I don't think these technologies are getting to address, in part probably because of just how resource intensive they are.
Yeah, no, that's an important point, and I should go back and look at the paper. I don't recall if they did a comparison of variation with age. In other words, one of the interesting questions is, and you can start to answer this, the single cell level, does the variation between individuals increase with age, right? We know it does for lots of phenotypes. You would expect it probably does the gene expression level, but there's some counter data that gene expression may actually become canalized or less variable with age in certain contexts. So you could probably get at that with a data set like this. I just don't recall whether they talked about that in the paper or not. So
no, I didn't see that either. Yeah.
So if somebody was just reading this on the Fox Health, it came across their sort of dashboard, what's some sort of like pragmatic or practical takeaways? Like if they're like, brain inflammation is important, how do I reduce that?
Yeah, I don't think there is anything from this paper for sure. And again, this is sort of what I was getting at. I don't think this fundamentally changes the way that we think about biological aging, the way that we approach interventions to improve health. It's much more of a basic science fundamental, create this sort of higher resolution understanding of the cell biology as opposed to what is the clinical application. There isn't an obvious clinical application for this study.
I would see in this one, the other thing that they did see was a vascular signature as well. And so that you're seeing neurovascular changes and sensitivities there, I think is really interesting. And it's moving us steps closer to building this evidential basis around neurovascular interactions as being a big driver of aging. And, this is a jump from their paper from what I read, but into neurodegenerative diseases.
Yeah. But again, I would say we already knew that. I mean, you look at Veronica Galvin's stuff with rapamycin showing her model is at least at the time, her model was the reason why rapamycin is beneficial for Alzheimer's disease and other dementias is it improves vascular function in the brain. Yes. So this fits that. It's consistent with that. I don't think it fundamentally changes any hypotheses. So
does it reinforce though the importance of like sleep, stress, blood sugar?
It does in a very indirect way, right? You're like 4 steps removed. But yes, that's a plausible explanation for why those things are important.
That from that long-term thinking about how we go about treating things like neurodegeneration and dementias, I really like that, this paper isn't necessarily talking about this directly, but this idea that we target A beta, we target downstream disruptions and proteostasis, instead of aiming at what is very likely the initial driving seat where neurovascular destabilization ends up kicking off dementias.
No, I agree completely. Obviously, I do. But and you're right. I mean, I think this is actually maybe one of the things to me that is really exciting is I am super psyched that the Allen Institute is actually starting to think about aging as opposed to that reactive sort of approach of let's characterize what a diseased brain looks like. No, let's characterize why a brain becomes diseased. And so that is really, I think, a good sign that the Allen Institute is coming around to the idea that, no, we should actually understand the biology of aging.
So that's maybe the coming for full circle.
And maybe
to your
Kelly
question.
had an important role in that.
Absolutely. Kelly knows that literature very well. But full circle to your point about what should you do if you're thinking about this? Well, if neurovascular disruption is an early preceding factor that leads to dementias, go for a run. Go challenge your neurovascular stuff. Go, it's another, you go for some exercise. Maybe that would be the prescriptive thing to come out of this paper.
What about mental exercise like puzzles and new challenges?
I wish there was more literature on that. I would love to learn more about that kind of, we kind of maybe hokily think about it as like brain exercising in some kind of way. But yeah, what happens if you do challenge your brain to dump more glucose into the system, offload more waste products into it?
So, I mean, this is not exactly the same model, but there's lots of evidence, at least in animal models, and I think there's probably evidence in humans as well, that environmental complexity definitely plays a role in aging phenotypes, including cognitive function. So in mice, for example, there are these what people call environmental enrichment models, where they just make the environment more stimulating. And it can be done lots of different ways. It can be visually, can be sound, can be odor. That actually has positive effects in many cases, maybe not all, but in many cases on aging phenotypes, including cognitive function, which is consistent with the idea that stimulating the brain, independent of physical exercise, can have protective effects. So, I mean, again, this is where maybe it's not rock solid that stimulating your brain is going to maintain function longer, but it's very likely to be true, and there's not a lot of downside to doing it. So
you can learn new things. And
yeah.